Hello, my name is Kristen Bolden, and I'd like to welcome you to the other side of history. In this talk, I would like to talk on the prophet Ezekiel. Now, Jeremiah, he was the prophet that God used to warn God's people that they were going to be taken captive by Babylon, and this was because of their sins. Ezekiel, he was the prophet of the exile. And both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they were prophets at the same time period. In Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1, Ezekiel, he says, "In the 30th year, in the 4th month, in the 5th day of the month, I was among the captives by the river of Chebar." Now in verse 3, we find that the Chebar River was in the land of the Chaldeans. The Jewish exiles, they settled by the banks there of the Chebar River, which historians say was actually a large canal that conducted water from the Euphrates River to the city, which lay just a short distance southeast of the city of Babylon. Now, we all know that Babylon was the glory of the ancient world. It was that head of gold on Nebuchadnezzar's image, a fitting representation of the wealth of that great city. Even today, the awesomeness of ancient Babylon is still dimly visible in the ruins that have been uncovered. While in exile, the Jews who were taken captive, they undoubtedly visited the great city of Babylon. Guarding the approach to the interior of the city of Babylon was the magnificent Ishtar Gate, named in honor of Ishtar, the mother goddess. Through the gate, one would enter what was called the processional street and advance towards a ziggurat that rose above the city like a lofty mountain. Today, one can still see within the beautiful brick figures of bulls and dragons. All who visited the city of Babylon, they were dazzled by its splendor. In verse 3 of chapter 1, in Ezekiel, we find that Ezekiel was a priest, just as Jeremiah was also a priest. Not only was Ezekiel of the priestly class, but he must have belonged also to the aristocracy there in Jerusalem, because he was part of the first captivity. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he took only the best of the population and he left the poorest people. We find that in 2 Kings chapter 24, verse 14. And it says, "And he, Nebuchadnezzar, carried away all Jerusalem and all the princes and all the mighty men of valor, even 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen and smiths. None remained, save the poorest sort of the people of the land." So why did Nebuchadnezzar do this? Why did he take captive the cream of the crop, so to speak? Well, this was because he wanted to use their skills in his kingdom, right? Now, Babylon was not really that bad for the exiles. They had their own homes. Ezekiel himself had his own home. We find that in Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 24. And it says, "Then the Spirit entered into me, and set me upon my feet, and spake with me, and said unto me, Shut thyself within thine house." Now amongst the Jews, there were many skilled craftsmen, and they were put to work there in Babylon. There was no such a thing as anti-Semitism in those days. The Israelites, they were not crowded into dingy ghettos and then herded into concentration camps. The Babylonian Jews, they were permitted to move about freely and to live in their communities within or near the great cities and to carry on their way of life. Tablets have been discovered from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar by archaeologists. They were found amongst the ruins of ancient Babylon. And they mention payments of rations and things like oil and barley to the foreign captives in exchange for skilled labor. Jeremiah had given the Jews advice on what they were to do when they were taken captive. And we can read that in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 7. It says, "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all that are carried away captives, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem unto Babylon, build ye houses, and dwell in them, and plant gardens, and eat the fruit of them. Take ye wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, that ye may be increased there, and not diminished. And seek the peace of the city, whither I have caused you to be carried away captives, and pray unto the Lord for it. For in the peace thereof shall ye have peace." God was really very merciful to his people because he had called them a nation of rebels. And he had said that they were impudent and stubborn, having a hard forehead and a stubborn heart. The people really were in revolt against Yahweh's sovereignty. Now, in Ezekiel chapter 13 and also chapter 22, Ezekiel, he gives a long list of the sins that Israel was committing against God. In fact, the picture seemed so dismal that in chapter 22, verse 30, God said, "And I sought for a man amongst them that should make up the hedge and stand in the gap before me for the land, that I should not destroy it. But I found none." Ezekiel, he let the people know that there would be retribution for their sins. He announced that Jerusalem would be taken under siege and that the city would fall. The people seemed to refuse to believe that Jerusalem would fall. It was as though because the temple was there, it would somehow prevent any destruction of Jerusalem. In all the rebellion, the people still had the utmost reverence for Jerusalem and the temple. They didn't seem to get it, that their sins removed God's presence from Jerusalem, the temple, and their lives. They thought somehow that it was only a form of godliness that mattered. Those that were convinced that the prophecies of the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple were true thought that it would be in the far distant future. Surely they didn't have to worry about it right then. Surely it would not happen in their own time. Now, Psalms 137 verses 1 through 6. It records the feelings of Israel in their captivity there in Babylon and their attachment that they had to Jerusalem. It says, "By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept, when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chiefest joy." Now there had been an open hatred towards Jeremiah and his prophecies, but Ezekiel did not seem to generate the same kind of hostility. Ezekiel thought the people seemed to almost enjoy hearing his sermons. Now, Ezekiel chapter 33, and this is verses 30 through 32. It describes the spirit towards Ezekiel by the people. It says, "Also thou, son of man, the children of thy people still are talking against thee by the walls and in the doors of the houses, and speak one to another, every one to his brother, saying, Come, I pray you, and hear what is the word that cometh from the Lord. And they come unto thee, as the people cometh, and they sit before thee as my people. And they hear thy words, but they will not do them. For with their mouths they show much love, but their heart goeth after their covetousness. And, lo, thou art unto them as a very lovely song of one that hath a pleasant voice, and can play well on an instrument. For they hear thy words, but they do them not." Ezekiel, he did do some things that perhaps could have been considered amusing. First of all, he took a brick of clay and he drew a diagram of Jerusalem under siege, showing the siege mounds, the camps, and the battering rams. We find that all in chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. And then he lay for 390 days on his left side and for 40 days on his right side to indicate the number of years that Israel and Judah, respectively, would be punished. We find that in chapter 4, verses 4 through 8. Now, while he was lying on his side, he weighed out small rations of food and water to show the privations that of this coming siege. Now, we find that in chapter 4, and that's verses 9 through 11. He cut off his hair with a sword and separated it into 3 parts to portray the 3 kinds of fate that would befall the people of Jerusalem. And we find that in chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. And then he packed his baggage, and at night he dug through the wall, suggesting a person trying to flee from the city under the cover of darkness. And that's in chapter 12, verses 1 through 16. And then he ate his bread with quaking, and he drank his water with trembling to symbolize the nervous fear that men would experience during the coming siege. And that's in chapter 12, verses 17 through 20. Now, then his wife, the delight of his eyes, she died. And he refrained from mourning as a sign to the exiles that the news of the fall of Jerusalem would fill them with sorrow too deep for tears. And that's in chapter 24, verses 15 through 27. Ezekiel's words and signs, they did stir up a mild interest and even some curiosity, but they did not evoke a repentance amongst the people. They probably thought of him as some kind of an eccentric. When a fugitive came with the news that Jerusalem had fallen and that the temple had been destroyed, the people, they fell into a state of despair and remorse. It was then that Ezekiel spoke to the people of the Good Shepherd and how he wanted to give them a new heart. It is in Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 26, that we find a beautiful text. It says, "A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you an heart of flesh." If the people allowed this to be done in their lives, God also promised them in chapter 37, verse 26. "Moreover, I will make a covenant of peace with them. It shall be an everlasting covenant with them, and I will place them and multiply them, and I will set my sanctuary in the midst of them forevermore. In Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 through 10, Ezekiel, he had a vision of a valley of dry bones. This vision is a beautiful word picture of what God wants to do with our spiritually dead natures. He wants to take us and he wants to put spiritual life into us so that instead of being spiritually dead, we can be spiritually alive. There's a beautiful little song that was composed by Felix Mendelssohn, who was also a Jew. Now, the song is titled, "O Rest in the Lord," and it is from his oratorio, Elijah. Now, the oratorio, it follows the events described in the book of Kings when Elijah fled to the wilderness there from Queen Jezebel. Then, when Elijah was in despair, an angel of the Lord appears and comforts him with the words, "O rest in the Lord." Like the prophet Elijah, the prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they also went through trying and even depressing times. God's people, they were in apostasy, and it was their job to tell them that they were in apostasy. Yet, as God told Elijah to rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him, God was also telling Jeremiah and Ezekiel to do the same. Now, in Ezekiel's vision there of the valley of dry bones, out of these dead, dry bones, some came to life. Some of the spiritually dead people, they allowed God to breathe spiritual life into them. In time, the Jews were allowed to return to Jerusalem and even to rebuild the temple. Let's remember the words to that beautiful song of Mendelssohn's. "O rest in the Lord, wait patiently for him, and he shall give thee thy heart's desires." If you have enjoyed this little talk, I would just like to encourage you to click on that like and subscribe button. And I just want to thank each one of you for listening, and I'm wishing God's blessings on each one of you.